election in 1992 when George H.W. Bush loses to this up-and-coming new face in Washington, William Jefferson Clinton. So, who is this governor from Arkansas? Well, he was born William Jefferson Blythe III in Hope, Arkansas on August 19th of 1946. His biological father died just a bit before he was born, and his mother ended up remarrying Roger Clinton. Later, William Jefferson took his stepfather's last name and became William Jefferson Clinton. He had a younger brother born of Roger Clinton and his mother Virginia Blythe, also called Roger Clinton Jr. And he attended Hot Springs High School. He was a great saxophonist, and this is one of the iconic symbols of Clinton is him playing the saxophone. And he ended up going to Boys State, which is an organization for youth run by the American Legion, which is a military, like retired military, patriotic organization that tries to bring up young people and encourage young people to get into politics and government service, etc. And he was part of this organization, was sent to Washington, D.C., to what they call Boys Nation, and there he ended up meeting President John F. Kennedy at the White House. This was an important moment in William Jefferson Clinton's life. He considers it a turning point when he actually starts considering entering politics and public life himself. He very much saw President Kennedy as an ideal role model, and he was sparked on by this to pursue a career in politics. He goes to Georgetown University and studies international affairs, but then he takes a Rhodes Scholarship and gets into Oxford University. He is drafted for the war in Vietnam. However, he goes back to Arkansas, but he ends up enrolling in the ROTC program at the University of Arkansas Law School in order to avoid military service. This later haunts him in his political career when he is considered a Dodge drafter. The fact of being, dodging the draft obviously was not a positive point for him in his political career, but he does finish law school, and then he goes back to Oxford and considers himself exonerated, if you will, from his military service. He there, in law school at Yale, he meets his future wife, Hillary Rodham, and they get married and have their only daughter, Chelsea. Then he launches himself into his political career. He becomes governor of Arkansas twice, and then this becomes his trampoline to the presidency. And as I said in the previous slideshow on Bush, he was very attractive to the American public, both because he was handsome, young, and full of energy, but also because he was considered someone who was caring, and he had a very affable personality. Even his rivals often would say that he was just a nice guy to be around, and he really drew the American public towards his program to balance the budget and get the economy back online, and as we know, this was one of Bush's weak points. And so he ends up winning the 1992 election and is inaugurated the next year at the age of 46. Thus, he is the third youngest president in history. We had, Teddy Roosevelt, we remember he rose to the presidency, he was the youngest, and then the youngest elected president was JFK himself. And then we have William Jefferson Clinton as the third youngest president. Two big pieces of legislation on the domestic front that he's able to get through are the Family and Medical Leave Act and the Violence Against Women Act. He also works hard on cutting on crime and gun violence. He works on education, environment, and welfare reform. However, he has a big challenge because when Clinton takes office, almost immediately afterwards, the Republicans gain control of the Congress. And this does not allow him to put through a lot of the programs that he would have wanted because there's conflict between the presidency and the legislative branch. However, he is known as being the first president since the Supreme Court decision Roe versus Wade to support abortion on demand, which means abortion at any time and under any circumstances. He ends up raising taxes quite a bit, which is his way of reducing the federal deficit. Eventually, he will be able to get the deficit under control, and in his second term, he actually balances the budget. He attempted to enact a universal health insurance program for all Americans. He actually appointed his wife, Hillary Clinton, to be in charge of the planning committee, and they came up with a very complex program which did not go over well with the American public, nor did it go over well with insurance companies or with medical personnel. So they basically had opposition on all fronts, both political opposition from conservatives, etc., but also from the whole healthcare industry. So it fell apart before it even got started. It was never even acted upon in Congress. Two important positions were filled during the Clinton administration by women. Janet Reno was the first U.S. Attorney General, female Attorney General, and Madeleine Albright was the first female U.S. Secretary of State. So he brought many women and minorities into government posts. And then he appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the Supreme Court, as well as Stephen Breyer. So these are two appointments that are still sitting Supreme Court justices. You might remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg when I spoke about her in the slideshow on the politics of protest. She was basically the example I was constantly using for a liberal interpretation of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. How would the ERA be interpreted by the courts, and how was it intended by the writers of the ERA? How was it intended to actually help women, or how was it intended to change society, I should say? And I used Ruth Bader Ginsburg as the litmus test, as the standard, if you will, for the liberal interpretation of the ERA, precisely because she is a liberal Supreme Court justice, so she would be one of the key figures that would be considering legislation that came up under this ERA amendment, and because she's a woman. So I think she's a good compass, if you will, for the judgment on the ERA and how it should be interpreted, or how it would be interpreted later on by the courts. Then on the foreign policy front, Clinton made a few interventions, one in Haiti, trying to reinstate the democratically elected president there who had been overthrown, and another in Bosnia, and they ended up brokering the Dayton Accords, which ended the war in Bosnia and brought peace to the region. But later on, I will mention that in both of these circumstances, he ended up overstepping his authority as commander-in-chief of the military in the deployment of the military without considering the opinion of Congress. Anyway, Clinton ended up ratifying NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which we remember had been already negotiated by his predecessor, Bush, but he's the one that actually puts it into act. And so we have free trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. He wins a second term, and against Bob Dole, who's the Republican candidate. We have another situation where Ross Perot is also running at the same time. So we remember him from the previous election when there was Bush, Clinton, and Perot as three main candidates. Again, he appears, although he does not make as good a sweep. In the previous election, we remember he had about 19% of the popular vote. Now he has only 8.4, so he's fading out. And really, this is the last major third-party candidate we've had in recent history that's had any sort of impact on the elections. But he had his role. And this is the first time with Clinton's victories, the first time since FDR that a Democrat has won 2 consecutive terms to the presidential office. So he's starting to make history. In his second term, he benefits from an incredible technology boom and the rise of the internet. This is the period of history, the 1990s, when the economy is really creating what we call a bubble. And because of this incredible boom in technology, there's these boom in investments, but it's a temporary thing, because when the investments go sky high and out of proportion, investors will eventually start to lose confidence, and the bubble, as we call it, will bust. But he is able to ride on a healthy economy with low unemployment, and this will be very helpful in his approval ratings overall. So the general situation in the economy is good. He ends up, like I mentioned previously, he ends up balancing the budget and actually producing a surplus, which is incredible, because if we think about it, not too long ago, the United States was pretty bad in debt, thanks to the buildup of the military, mostly from the Cold War period. So now the military has been cut back, and a lot of programs had been cut back by both Reagan and Bush. And now with Clinton's hikes in the taxes, he's actually able to balance the budget. So this is probably his most positive point, if you will. And then he opens up trade with China, normal trade relations with China, which is a bit controversial, especially because this is the moment in history when China has cracked down on civil and political rights. And this is the moment when we have the Tiananmen Square massacre. So it's kind of a controversial issue in the United States that he has opened up trade with China at this moment when China has not demonstrated respect for human rights. So it becomes a human rights issue. Then he helps to broker peace in Northern Ireland in 1998, and he launched airstrikes against Iraq because of their chemical and biological weapons program, to deter them in their development of these weapons of mass destruction. He also led a NATO force to try to stop the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. So this was a coalition force, not just the United States, but obviously the United States was the leader in this movement, and Kosovo was, the peace was restored to this region. So in the midst of all these events that are going on in his second term, one of the more important things that comes forward in the news, if you will, is the scandal of Monica Lewinsky. So this situation comes out of a whole series of court cases that involve various women who have accused him of improper sexual relationships or sexual harassment, etc. In the series of trials that he has to undergo, he ends up committing perjury, and he is also charged with the obstruction of justice with regard to these cases. He is then impeached by the House, and if you remember, the House of Representatives is the body that can impeach the president or Supreme Court justices or other officials in the government. And that means that they officially accuse him of a crime. And so the House of Representatives officially accused President Clinton of perjury and the obstruction of justice and a number of other criminal acts. And then he had to go on trial before the U.S. Senate. But because many people considered this whole situation really just a political move to try to politically defeat the president, it ended up dividing on party lines, which it often does, and the U.S. Senate was not there was not a high enough majority to actually convict him of the charges, and so he was acquitted, and he finished his second term as president. And he was only, at this point, he was only the second president to be impeached. We remember there was Andrew Johnson, who was impeached but also acquitted by the Senate, and then there was Richard Nixon, who was going to be impeached, but he ended up resigning before that happened, before taking the country through the whole trial process. Instead, Clinton was impeached, and he also remained in office. Now, I want to give you a complete picture of President Clinton, because if we just look at these basic facts of some of his economic successes and his domestic policies and his foreign policies, I don't think you have a clear idea of who he is as a man and what the American public think of him, not necessarily in general, but some of the considerations that were made during his presidency and afterwards. It's important that you see the whole picture. So here I have a quick timeline that kind of shows you chronologically his life from his birth to when he retires as a president and the major moments that he lived. And then I wanted to address the economic issue. I mentioned it when we were talking about the balancing of the budget. The title of this slide, "It's the Economy, Stupid," was one of his slogans during his election. Actually, it was during his first election in 1992. So remember, Bush was not able to handle the economic situation, and he wasn't able to connect with the American people. Clinton is able to connect, and he realizes that people think that their pocketbook, that their wallet is more important than some sort of peace treaty that Bush has been able to make overseas, in the foreign policy area. It's more important what happens in their own hometown, what happens to their own job, and what happens to their own wallet, their own money. And so Clinton focuses very much on the economy, and and he has this slogan: "It's the economy, stupid. That's the question. That's what people care about. That's what's the big problem right now, okay? So we need to focus on that." And he was right. That's what people wanted, and that's why he had a great victory despite the third party candidate, Ross Perot. However, as I mentioned, he was very fortunate to be able to preside over a bubble economy, which usually any president in their first, at least in their first term, are usually dealing with the effects of the previous administration, right? Because the economy doesn't usually change night and day on a larger scale unless you have major events like September 11th, for example, or what we're living right now. It's a very unusual situation, and it's a significant event that drastically changes the whole worldwide situation. So the coronavirus, but that's very unusual. We're not talking about those kinds of situations here. We're talking about a normal economy that's suffering the ups and downs of interest rates, of employment, of fixed prices or fixed wages, or any normal market changes. And so that's usually a gradual thing. And he's living in a moment of a bubble economy, like I said, thanks to the technological advances and the boom of the internet and the investment that was made into these new means of communication at that time. And with Clinton, he also ended up deregulating a lot of the market laws that had been placed to try to contain speculative fevers. So speculation was able to really boom, and investors were able to basically do whatever they wanted in this new technological um, rage, and the bubble economy just grew and just boomed. However, eventually the investors would lose their confidence, and as all bubbles, it will come to an end. It'll be popped, and in the end, it ended up popping in around the year 2008 with a pretty significant crash in the world economies. But the biggest part of this bubble, if you will, was the inflated U.S. dollar. And this was due in great part to the trade deficit that had been created with the Clinton administration. And this was done through the NAFTA agreement, through the opening with China, etc., but in such a way that there were many agreements that were made to the detriment of American workers. And Clinton also ignored the minimum floor on labor, human rights, or environmental standards in the trade agreements, which was problematic for the United States in the long run. And this significant trade deficit actually increased 5 times in his presidency. So it was a real imbalance that then later plays out to the detriment of the U.S. economy. And so although he was able to balance the budget and some things seemed to be going right, there was kind of a time bomb that was ready to go off, and ended up going off. And so during his terms, real wages stagnated, and many manufacturing and service jobs moved overseas for cheaper labor, etc. With these open trade agreements, thus damaging the whole working economy of the United States. And of course, the middle class was really suffering under these huge tax hikes that he had to put in place in order to try to balance the budget. So there was kind of a give and take. There was a positive side and a negative side to this economic moment. There was also a significant rise in predatory lending practices. Like I say, with the doing away of the regulatory structure, this led to a lot of bad practices by banks, mortgage companies, etc. And it ended up costing a lot of middle-class Americans their mortgages, and there were more foreclosures in this moment than there had been in about 30 years in U.S. history. So it wasn't exactly a golden moment for the economy. But let's look beyond the economy, right? Let's look to the real situation, the real character, and the whole picture of who William Jefferson Clinton really was. There are many, many allegations out there against the Clintons, and when I say the Clintons, I'm including his wife as well. And I write here, although the mainstream media stonewalls any accusations against the Clintons, and what does that mean? That means that they don't publish them, they don't or at least they don't publish the truth about it. We remember how the media plays such an important role when we talked about their role in the Vietnam War, and how things are presented can change the public opinion, but it can be just presented completely wrong, and almost cover-ups can be made, etc. So they do try to stonewall these accusations against the Clintons, and they call them only political questions. So, like I mentioned with the Monica Lewinsky, which really probably was a political question. I mean, it's basically mud throwing, and then trying to get something out in order to politically bring down your opponent, right? So they said that everything was a political question. However, some things I don't think can really fall into that category, especially when there's real hardcore evidence that backs it up. You know, it's one thing talking about having an affair with an intern and he wants to try to cover that up. And, you know, his political opponents try to bring it out. And you're just like, come on, guys, you know, get a life, you know, let's move on to more important questions. Okay, that can be a political struggle. But we're going to look at a few issues here that are way more than just political questions of mud throwing at someone. So, ever since his days in Arkansas until the present, there have been countless numbers of allegations against Bill and Hillary of drug trafficking, money laundering, corruption, bribery, abuse of power, and even conspiracy to murder. They are the most accused and investigated political couple in U.S. history. However, the majority of investigations were inconclusive, and I put that in quotes because they were either inconclusive on purpose or they were inconclusive because, for example, they were obstructed by impediments such as the mass suicides of key witnesses. But this happens over and over and over again, and it's kind of creepy, to be completely honest with you. So let's just take some concrete examples, because you know, you don't ever, like I say, when you judge history, when you judge people in history, you need to really look at all the facts. You need to gather in the, you know, the evidence, and you need to try to listen and see both sides of it. So I'm going to pull out a couple examples, just concrete examples of these allegations and where they led to and what the conclusions were. So, bribes and payoffs. Many officials of the Clinton administration personally profited from their offices. Doesn't this happen all the time in politics, right? So we have here, first example, the Agricultural Secretary Mike Espy. He resigns in the face of allegations that he had taken illegal gifts from Tyson's Food. So Tyson's Food, and then we have illegal gifts also from the Sun, Diamond Growers. They sought favors from his department. So he ends up, what's he doing? He's giving favors from the agricultural department to these companies who then give him illegal gifts to his party affiliation, which is, you know, he's bedfellows with the Clintons. So they're all involved with this Tyson's Food scandal. And the same thing, Ron Brown, former Commerce Secretary, so he's in charge of the trade, right, the trade commerce section, before his death in a tragic air crash in Bosnia, also was being investigated by a special prosecutor for various offenses, including the receipt of bribes and falsifications of his financial disclosure reports. So he's in charge of the Commerce Department, and again, he's giving trade prerogatives in exchange for contributions. So we have this trafficking of money and favors from department heads under the Clintons that are then paid off to the party and the law firm of the Clintons with whom they're involved. Conflicts of interest. There are allegations of illegal campaign contributions by Indonesians to the Democratic Party, which ends up being called Indogate, and they get this word gate from our famous Watergate, thanks to Nixon. So every time there's a scandal now that comes out, we always add the word gate to the end of it, and so that means it's a scandal, right? So Indogate is a scandal that has to do with Indonesians, and it raises the fact that the Clinton administration, the foreign policy is for sale. What does that mean? I will treat your country or your party in your country, you know, your government, I will treat them favorably on the foreign scene. In other words, I will give you favorable trade agreements. I will support what you want in the UN. I will stand behind you against the party that's trying to overthrow you. Whatever it might be on the foreign policy scale, I'll be there for you if you donate to my campaign. And that's what ends up really happening. There's all these illegal donations, which there are actually laws in place limiting and not allowing foreign countries to give donations to political parties, because it's obvious if a foreign country is giving a donation to a political party in the United States, they're going to expect to get something back from that candidate if they win the election and become the head of state in the United States. So there's a give and take. It's pretty normal. They should not have interests in the internal American political situation. So that's why it's illegal for any party to be receiving money from another government, foreign government. John Huang's dual role as Democratic fundraiser, so this is a direct connection. He is actually the head of the Democratic fundraiser department, and he's an official in the Commerce Department, which is in charge of trade, raised serious issues of conflict of interest. The underlying problem is not the campaign finance system, as many brought out at the time, but rather the Clinton administration's disturbing propensity to use the power of the federal government for political aggrandizement. So what does that mean? I'll give you a fair trade agreement if you give me money. It's pretty simple, right? So, and you can't have the same guy in charge of the fundraising and the same guy in charge of the trade agreements and foreign commerce agreements. So that's a automatic conflict of interest. But it gets better. So we have here allegations of corruption and extortion. The Commerce Department is not the only one, right? So here we have an example of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, called FEMA, which manages the disaster relief money, and these monies were used to tie local communities to the federal government. In other words, they became dependent upon them, and if they did not support the candidates of their choice, etc., they would not receive the federal funding. The Immigration and Naturalization Services decided that they wanted to have a lot of Democratic voters in the next election, and so they pushed through citizenship grants to 1.2 million immigrants right before the election, and speeded up the process to the point where they didn't even do the criminal record checks. Nothing was done, and then they immediately signed them up to be voters. And obviously, hey, I gave you your citizenship within 2 weeks. You need to vote Democratic. And that's basically how the trade-off was with the immigration services. And then the best one for last is the Internal Revenue Service, which is the IRS, the famous IRS, which is the organization in the government that collects taxes. And according to the Wall Street Journal, which is a very well seen political and economic journal from the Wall Street, which is in New York, they declared that the IRS was in fact harassing conservative nonprofits that were considered enemies of the Clintons. In other words, they were exposing things about the Clintons, etc. And the misuse of the IRS audits and investigation powers against the enemies was one of the allegations actually raised in the articles of impeachment drawn up by the House Judiciary Committee for Nixon in 1974. So we see a kind of a parallel here, but the same thing that's being done by the Clinton administration has not been investigated or even brought up in the impeachment trial. So it's kind of interesting. They focus only on the perjury, etc., with regard to the Monica Lewinsky case, but they left out a lot of things that instead they had included in the impeachment process of Nixon. And they left out things like this, which, like I say, Wall Street Journal is a well-respected financial and political journalistic voice. And then we move on to the abuse of power. So he uses his powers as president either illegitimately or going beyond the powers that he has been given by the Constitution. So I mentioned before when we talked about Haiti and Bosnia that he did send troops without the approval of Congress. And then also he refused to enforce the Supreme Court decision, which had said that funds from union dues, unions, groups of workers that get together, right? Their dues, their money that they pay to that union for their membership cannot be used to support a specific political party. And instead, this money had been used for the Democratic candidate, and he refused to enforce the Supreme Court decision to refund the union dues. And the Clinton administration also invoked the doctrine of presidential immunity, but to an extreme um, extent, because they did not turn over documents that were subpoenaed by congressional committees when they were investigating, which is actually against the law, and that does not include presidential immunity. And he also claimed immunity from all civil action lawsuits, such as the Paula Jones sexual harassment suit, which was the case that brought out the whole scandal with Monica Lewinsky. So they were both tied together, and so he claims immunity from civil action lawsuits until he is no longer president. But that's basically saying that the president is above the law, that you can't accuse him of committing crimes or breaking the laws, and that has nothing to do with real presidential immunity. And the last big scandals that I want to bring out are Whitewater, Travelgate, and Filegate. So these are three other scandals that came out during the presidency of Clinton, in which Whitewater was basically the mass robbing of savings and loan associations that ended up costing the American taxpayers $60 million. So this wasn't like Whitewater was not in the same category as Watergate, for example. What happened in Watergate? Watergate was basically a situation where, okay, we want to win the election, and so we're going to break into the enemy camp, and we're going to steal some of their documents, and we're going to bug their phones so we know what they're talking about, what their plans are, so we can win the election. I mean, it's basically, bad play. Here, we're talking about a major corruption scheme and $60 million. So it's a bigger crime, if you will, but then the most important part was the actual covering up of the crimes. And so the Clintons were involved in the covering up and misleading the FBI and interfering with the investigation, including the death of the White House counsel Vince Foster, who was deeply involved in this case, and his death is kind of still considered a mystery. The official investigation into his death came back immediately with the fact that it was a suicide. He had put a gun into his mouth, he had shot through the back of his throat and through his head. And the interesting or curious thing was that the investigators could not get into Vince Foster's office until much later, after the Clinton administration had been able to go through his office, take out any information that was not for public viewing, and then the investigators were allowed to come in once everything was already, sifted through and swept. And the other minor detail, which was not in the official police report that had said that Vince Foster had committed suicide, was the fact that he had a gun wound through his neck. This is confirmed by the photos of the body and by the investigator who ended up resigning from his position because of the fraud and the corruption that was involved in the investigation and the obstruction of his investigation. So he's one of the counsels, and he ends up actually resigning. And in his resignation letter, he refers to this gun wound to the throat to the neck, and it was actually made by a different gun. So it's quite difficult to imagine that a man could commit suicide by shooting himself once in the neck with one gun and then shooting himself in the mouth through the head with another gun. That's pretty clever. Quite difficult to do. And so it was obvious that it was actually a murder, and this was all part of the Whitewater investigation cases. Travelgate, and Filegate are basically situations in which the FBI is used to bring charges against former employees in the White House Travel Office and make room. It's to sweep clean all the people that were there and to make room for the people that Clinton wanted put in those places. And this was obviously, you know, a big scandal because of these fraudulent charges that were brought up that was not true. And the Filegate was the illegal collection and storage of um, confidential FBI files in the White House in violation of the Privacy Act of individuals who no longer worked in the White House. And this came out too in the news, um, and was condemned by not even a conservative, David Broder, who he basically said this was one of the most flagrant abuses of constitutional authority any president can allow or commit. So he, universally condemned this illegal activity by the Clinton administration. So this is a whole slew of different cases, different situations, but you can understand that the Clintons were under almost constant investigation, and there were so many situations in which there were cover-ups, interference with investigations, investigators that gave up on the investigations, uh, and there were many situations that were quite disturbing with regard to these investigations. Like I had mentioned previously, many of the investigations were obstructed, and one of the main obstructions or the main problems with the investigations was the disappearance of witnesses. If you were a witness to something that you should not have been a witness to, you often committed suicide. And that brings us to our last slide. It's a very, I try to pack in a lot on this slide, okay? But this is to give you um, an idea of the number of people who were close associates with the Clintons who mysteriously died. Right? So most of these cases here um, have been declared accidents or suicides, but it's a lot of people in and around one couple to have died in such a short period of time. I especially take you to the end here of the list from numbers 35 to 46. These are all bodyguards of President and Mrs. Clinton who have died. Now think about it. Bodyguards are usually young men who are in good physical condition, who are also in good psychological condition. And you can have one bodyguard who might kind of go off his rocker, he might commit suicide for some sort of difficulty in his life or psychological weakness. You might have a bodyguard who, just like soccer players sometimes up and have a heart attack. Well, even if they seem to be young and healthy and fit, they could have a heart attack. But it's hard to imagine that this kind of category of persons, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 who die very unexpectedly. I mean, we're not talking about being shot in the line of duty. We're not talking about dying of cancer or of any, known disease. We're talking about suicides or unexplainable heart attacks or accidents. And it's just a really strange coincidence. But I want to draw your attention to a couple of these people on this list. I already mentioned to you Vince Foster, right? How he died of a gunshot wound to his head, but he also had one in his neck, and that was declared a suicide. Kind of strange. Another situation, Kathy Ferguson. She was the ex-wife of Arkansas trooper Danny Ferguson, who was found dead in May of 1994 in her living room with a gunshot to her head. It was ruled a suicide, even though there were several packed suitcases as if she were going somewhere. Now, Danny Ferguson was a co-defendant along with Bill Clinton in the Paula Jones lawsuit, and Kathy Ferguson was a corroborating witness for Paula Jones. Okay, so she's a witness that up and dies, commits suicide supposedly. Bill Shelton, the next guy on the list, is her fiancé. Right, so she's the ex-wife of Danny Ferguson, but now she's with Bill Shelton. He's an Arkansas state trooper, and her fiancé. He is very critical of the suicide ruling of his fiancée. He does not believe that she committed suicide, right? And he wants to investigate her death. He is then found dead in June of 1994. 1 month later, May of 1994, she dies. He wants to investigate her death. June 1994. How does he die? Wow, what a coincidence. Gunshot wound. Suicide. Oh, by the way, at the gravesite of his fiancée. Right? So, instead of investigating her suicide and trying to bring light on what he thought was a lie and a cover-up, he ends up deciding to commit suicide himself. And it's a little fishy, you know? First the witness commits suicide, and then the guy who doesn't believe that she committed suicide commits suicide. Too many suicides. Another really well-known, famous case is the Kevin Ives and Don Henry case, known as the Boys on the Track. This is back in Arkansas, in the days when the Clintons were in Arkansas in the governorship. And they were involved in a huge drug operation there in Arkansas. And these two boys, 16 and 17 if I remember correctly, they were out kind of hunting in the area, and people think that they might have stumbled upon the drug operation at the Mena, Arkansas airport. They were in that area, and these things were happening at night, and the boys were out at night. What happens? They are found on the railroad tracks by the train operator, who is coming barreling down on them in his train. He sees these two bodies laid out on the tracks, covered up with a green tarp. He tries to stop the train. He blows the whistle to wake them up, get them off, and they don't move. He can't stop the train in time, and he hits them. Now, the original investigation says that the boys had been asleep in some sort of drug stupor on the railroad tracks, and that's why they were killed by the train. They didn't wake up. But the family of the boys were not satisfied. Here we go again. We have it. There's something strange. There's something fishy. Apart from the fact that both families were positive that their sons were not dealing in drugs, they thought it was very strange that both their bodies were lying perfectly straight on the tracks if they were somehow falling asleep in a drug stupor, some sort of drug coma. And what happened to that green tarp that the train driver said he saw? They were covered in that green tarp, and the first witnesses corroborated on this. The police report had nothing said about the green tarp, and it was never found. The first analysis had said that they had died, that they had fallen asleep and they were in a drug stupor, and they had died from the train hitting them. When the families brought in private investigators after the case was closed, and they reopened the case and they exhumed their bodies, and they did another analysis with their own their own doctors and investigators, they found that the boys had actually been killed. One had been stabbed by a knife, and the other one had been smashed in the head. They had been dead before the train hit them and caused the train injuries. So, these things you can see from autopsies what the cause of death was and if a wound was made after the death of someone. And so, obviously, a grand jury reversed the original decision that had said that this was an accidental death and declared that it was a certain homicide, murder. However, they were never able to figure out, who was responsible for this murder. So, but these boys were the ones that had stumbled upon the drug operations, right? So how does this tie? Well, we have a whole slew of witnesses and persons who were involved in the case and who were able to make connections with this drug operation, which the Clintons were very deeply involved in this. However, all of these witnesses, as you see in the following list, ended up dying as well. And so we have these 6 witnesses, key witnesses, who all die, and you can see the years. July 88, November 88. It was in 88 that they declared that it was a homicide situation, so they had reopened it. 88, 88, 89, 89, 89, right? So it's kind of creepy that all of your witnesses just end up dying. One dies in a motorcycle slammed in the back of a truck. One is stabbed 113 times, one from a gunshot wound. One was shot, mutilated, and found burned in a trash dump. And the other one was decapitated. However, the coroner, which is the legal doctor, declared that his death was due to natural causes. Now, I don't know how natural causes can be declared when someone is decapitated, but we'll leave that to their investigation. And then another one was killed in a setup robbery in 89. So it's obviously the case fell apart. All the witnesses that were able to pin the boys to that area with this drug operation, that they had been witnesses, that they had been involved, that there was any connection to the Clintons and their involvement in the drug operation, it all fell apart because all the witnesses were killed before they were able to testify before the grand jury. And so these are just some examples of strange deaths of people who knew too much or who were too close to the Clintons in their entire political career. Like I say, starting from Arkansas all the way through the White House. So it's kind of a disturbing list, but um, you know, Hillary tries to defend her husband and both of them by saying there's a vast right-wing conspiracy that trumps everything up. But you might be able to say some things can be made up, but after a while, and you get so much and so many investigations and so many people dying, it just starts to make you think, well, there might just be something out there. There might just be some truth to it. And in fact, uh, you know, the Clintons are not considered to be always by the vast majority trustworthy. And that was a big problem then. Again, we noticed, in the more recent election, it was a big problem with regard to the election for Hillary. Just the ability to create an image, a trustworthy image, and a likable image. Fortunately, her husband, Bill, had a very good personality and was able to attract people, and people liked him. They just naturally liked him as a person. Hillary, unfortunately for her, didn't have that affability, and so she had to work against not only a very shady reputation and just uncertain uncertain confidence with regard to the American mentality, the American judgment of her, but also the fact that she didn't have an attractive personality. But this kind of gives you an overall look at the Clintons and their involvement. They're considered by some to be America's first crime family. Um, they're also viewed by many people as being wonderful people. So it's, you know, it's something to consider. And I've put here a long video called The Clinton Chronicles. It'll give you a lot of concrete evidence to corroborate some of the things that I'd put on the slides. It's optional. I'm not, you know, what I want you to know is the things on the slides. I want you to be able to give some examples. If I ask you for some examples of bribery or corruption or etc., I want you to be able to give some examples of these things, and also some examples of strange and mysterious deaths that are close to the Clintons, close associates. But I'm not going to ask you specific things from the Clinton Chronicles. So I just think it's for your information, for you to be able to have a complete picture. I've put it there, but it's optional for you. And with this, I will close with the Clinton era, and then I'll pick up with George W. Bush in the next chapter.